everyone. We should probably go ahead and get started. So I'm Lisa Zahavi, if you've never met me. I'm professor of design here in the Art and Art History department. So hopefully you'll take a class with me at some point if you haven't already. And so today, and I have to do this thing where I can't see out my glasses anymore up close. So today I am delighted to introduce all of you to one of my dearest friends, Morin. I had the great pleasure of working with Molly when we were both faculty members in the Department of Visual Arts and Design at Weber State University in Utah. Molly is currently an arts researcher in residence at Dartmouth College in their Digital Justice Lab in the Digital Humanities and Social Engagement Cluster. Molly earned her BFA at the University of Notre Dame and her MFA at Clemson University, and has taught as a faculty member at Weber State University in Utah, Millsaps College in Mississippi, and the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Molly works in sculpture and digital media and has given invited lectures at the Center for Research Computing at the University of Notre Dame, the Society for Science, Literature, and the Arts, and the National Academy of Science. She has exhibited nationally and internationally, including solo exhibitions at the Collaboratory at UC Santa Barbara, Wittenberg University, Lamar University, the University of Dallas, and the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. She was a 2020 Utah Visual Arts Fellow, and her work is included in the state's Alice Merrill Horn collection. So now I'm going to read the really smart stuff that Molly wrote on her own website. Morin's work teases out long-held cultural assumptions influenced by Enlightenment logics that we accept as true, neutral, and necessary, and explores ways in which recent advances in computation can amplify and extend power imbalances already present in social, political, and art world systems. Her sculptures and drawings are often poetic physical embodiments of data sets and algorithms in diverse media. Her practice includes fabric manipulation, felting, machine knitting, machine cut plastic, machine drawing, generative drawing, performative drawing, projection, animation, data visualization, and physical computing, in which interactions between media are experimental with constantly shifting boundaries. Some of her recent work draws on her experience as a competitive weightlifter and coach to explore issues around gender, power, and agency. Now the rest of this is my bit. Molly also loves dogs, vintage and retro cookbooks, high-quality dark chocolate, growing vegetables, and having long and involved discussions about art and life. She and I have had many amazing adventures together, including a very memorable trip out to see the installation piece Sun Tunnels by Nancy Holt. Molly is the person who taught me the proper way to do squats and deadlifts, for which I will be forever grateful. We are so lucky she was able to join us today. Please give a welcoming, warm applause to Molly Morin.
Hi, Lisa, thank you so much. What a warm and generous introduction. You've just really set the standard for intros, and the next time I introduce an artist, I hope to be that good at it. I want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you, Lisa, for bringing me in. Thank you to the department for supporting my trip. I had a really lovely talk with Lisa and Ben and Otto earlier. I met Kira, I hope she's here somewhere. And that was really lovely. So I've had a lovely day on your campus, and I really appreciate you being here. I know that this is like a really packed time of year, and there are a million places you could be, and I really appreciate you choosing to spend this hour with me. As Lisa said, my name is Molly Morin. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an artist. I was a professor for a very long time. And today I'm going to talk to you about my body of work. I'm organizing my work today around these three sort of ideas: curiosity, embodied pleasure, and situated knowing. And I'm also going to highlight a few of the technologies that I use as I go. I wanted to, and you'll see those are highlighted in pink throughout my talk, to kind of remind us that these are techniques that can be useful to the work, but they're maybe not like the most interesting part of the work, right? The interesting part of the work is always sort of what we're saying with it, and how we're sort of thinking about those technologies. So these are sort of the categories. I'll introduce myself first, and then introduce you to my work. I'm going to try to go for about 45 minutes. I'm going to start a timer now, so we have time for questions. And if anything is unclear while I am talking, please, please, please raise a hand, let me know, and I will do my best to address those. I built a little cushion in. So if there's something that you need to know before we're finished, we don't have to be super, super formal about that endpoint. So are you still able to hear me in the back? Okay, great. A little bit about me. I want to situate myself because my experiences, my privileges all inform the work I'm making and the work I'm able to make. So my name is Molly. I am a white, cis, settler, queer, second generation academic. So in many ways, I have a lot of like really advantageous platforms that I'm starting with as I'm making work. I'm also a New Englander. I lived in Utah for almost 10 years, and I am a new resident of Vermont. I'm a homeowner on unceded ancestral homelands of the Nadakina and Wabanaki tribes, and I'm married and I have 3 dogs, right? So all of this infrastructure is really supporting my ability to make, and I want to honor the privilege that I have in doing that. I was an art professor for 15 years, an arts researcher in residence at Dartmouth, and I work in digital fabrication, parametric and machine drawing, fiber systems, and data, as Lisa also mentioned. And finally, and this becomes important to a large body of my work, I am a competitive weightlifter, this is me, coach and Utah State record holder. And this sort of use of my body really informs my interests in the body and in information. So, as I mentioned, I've organized my work loosely into 3 or 4 kind of batches. And the first thing I want to address is this idea of curiosity. And my work is driven out of a curiosity for how things work, how I might be able to make things, and how seemingly disparate things relate to each other. I've noticed that every few years I need a new medium or a new subject because I get like bored, right? And so my work is really, really fueled by kind of a constant problem solving and curiosity. A couple of precedents for this section. I think a lot about this Roy Lichtenstein painting. So when I look at this painting, what I'm thinking about are those like big brush strokes that are a reference to probably like the Abex art that came right before Lichtenstein's work. And I'm thinking about those halftone dots that represent a new printing technology in the back, and how this sort of technological medium impacts our modes of expression. And I find this to be a really interesting commentary on how technology and the art world are sort of interacting, and there's like this push and pull. Also, Leah Villarreal, this is his work, Escape Velocity. I'm just here thinking about how mathematical principles and computing can produce like really beautiful forms. So starting with these as like things I'm curious about, very briefly, because we're at school right now, I'm going to show you, this is my graduate work. So this is a project called Digital Figuring I did. I made, and this is just some practice things, I made a lot of this work on a laser cutter. So it's modeled in 3D, and then it's cut on a laser cutter and folded back up into these big objects. And I made these between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. because the architecture students got dibs on the laser cutters. And so I was like basically sneaking in. I think as students you may know this, sometimes you're like a little bit scrappy about figuring out how to get done what needs done. And that's kind of what happened for these. This work it was long story, not for today, but thinking about Facebook and social networks, right? It's 2007. Things like Facebook are relatively new to me. And I was making these drawings, and these drawings were made like in Illustrator. So imagine making a shape, copying it 5 times into a pattern, copying that whole shape, copying it 10 more times into a pattern, and so on and so forth. And this is part of where I get at the curiosity piece, is that I made this work in Illustrator and I was crashing computers left and right in the computer lab, right? Again, it's 2007, so everything's still a little slower than what we experience now. And I knew that there was a better way to do this than copy, paste. Even if I was like building actions in Illustrator, for those of you who are kind of geeky about something like Illustrator, even if I was building methods, I knew there was a better way to do this. And I got really lucky. And I had a friend who told me, you ought to be able to write a computer program to do that. And so this is a similar system in which I have an organized set of shapes that rotate around themselves in a really organized way. But this is written in the programming language processing. Because your students, again, the way I figured out how to use the programming language processing is I opened a book to page 1 and I spent 30 minutes to an hour every morning just copying the examples. I didn't have like previous programming experience. For those of you who are interested in what we would call creative coding, processing, and a P5. Are any of you familiar with processing or P5? All right. Okay, so if this stuff looks fun to you, see Professor's a hobby. And so what's cool about this program, right, is that I can write a little bit of code and hit play, and it'll show me what I made right away. So if you're a person who's maybe interested in systems and interested in algorithms, this is a really easy sort of entree. But this was sort of like, I already had a shape I was trying to make. I was like, can I figure out how to code it? I didn't set out to be like a code artist, but I was making forms like this. And to kind of bring this back to the idea of like technology and data, this is like a really organized sort of spiral graph form. And the specific shapes are driven by the binary values of the ASCII letters of people's names. So this is the name Ingrid. She was my roommate at the time. And so in effect, these are like portraits. And I was thinking about the idea of data and representation at the time. And how do I sort of call into question, right? This is maybe accurate where like every time I use that string of numbers, I'll generate this pattern, but is it meaningful? I'm not sure. And so sort of thinking about that relationship of data to people and to life experience. And so this is, just for those of you who are interested, this is like right after graduate school. And it was a really, like having this ability to write programs, to execute ideas became really important to my work for a long time. From there, this is a work in which each panel you see here is a day, and all of the text messages I sent and received on that day are encoded in those flower forms. The way you would decode this is that the messages I sent are in pink, and the messages that I received are in like blue and purple. And each bunch of flowers is a message. So that bunch up at the top is one message, in which each flower is a word, and each petal is a letter. So that big flower is a long word, and those small flowers are short words. I mean, it's really that simple, but trying to translate these things, again, it's 2011, I'm not sure, I might still have a T9 keyboard, right? I might not have a full alphabet keyboard at that point. And so I'm still sort of figuring out what that medium is, but trying to sort of think about how this is human interaction still. So thinking about sending bouquets of flowers back and forth, say. And this is again written in processing, right? So I took a spreadsheet, said, okay, this is how the flowers are gonna look, and develop these forms. And this is, 3 weeks of a month. I think I have a full month of these sort of panels that give you day by day my text messages. And you can see like some days are quite dry, like right in the middle there. I don't think I got it in. Right, and some days are quite busy. It's a very, again, it's 2011, right? So the sort of volume of text is really different too. And kind of a final project in this section. In this moment, I'm really searching for a little more richness, right? I really like this idea of like, I can take things like data and make them, maybe warm them up, make them more human, find a new way to represent things. But they're ancient prints. For me, they feel really cold. My degrees are all in sculpture, and so I'm really oriented toward materials and tactility. So in this work, this is still an inkjet print. It's still like a data visualization in the way the others are, but I was really trying to create the effect of like smearing ink, right? So I'm trying to think of this inky surface. Close up, these are made out of little rectangles and lines, but just in such multiples that they kind of smear, right? So I'm trying to create these inky surfaces. These loosely are visualizations of poems by the astrophysicist Rebecca Elson, and I'll read one of her poems in a minute. And so here, like each shape is a word, but I'm also, this is a poem called The Invention of Zero, and I'm trying to give you like a little bit the sensibility of like progress and moving, but also a sensibility about like counting each by each. So there's like a data visualization thing in there, but there's also this like very representational kind of poetic impact that I'm hoping they'll have. And this is a section of Red Balloon, which is the poem I'd like to read you. And I pull this out because this book was really influential to me in thinking about the relationship of like what it means to think about science and information and what it means to be human. And the poem is called Girl with a Balloon. It starts, most of the helium in the universe was created in the Big Bang. From this, the universe, in its industrial age, with all the stars lit up, roaring, banging, splitting, their black ash settling into every form of life, you might look back with longing to the weightlessness, the elemental of the early years. As leaning out the window, you might see a child going down the road, a red balloon, a little bit of pure Big Bang bobbing at the end of her string. And I think about this idea a lot, that when we talk about things like physics and the size of the universe, it's very hard for us to kind of conceptualize that space. And there's something really wonderful about the way poetry, in this case, takes this big concept and makes it really sort of tangible for us in that helium balloon, like a little bit of pure Big Bang. And so as we go to the next section, I'm kind of thinking about that embodiment and that tangibility in the work. How are we doing so far? Is everybody able to hear? Cool. Everybody still awake? Okay. So in this section, I want to introduce, we're thinking about like something like data visualization or being a body in the age of data. We're thinking about systems and coding, but I want to introduce this idea of embodiment. This work as a precedent is the work of Iking Ijeoma, and what you see here is an interface in which I can type in my hourly wage, what I make hourly, and that interface controls this sort of topographic map that's in a vat of dark liquid. So what happens here, this is called Wage Islands, is the heights of the bits. This is a map of New York City. The higher the bit, the cheaper the rent is in the area that's being represented, right? So it's sort of an inverse relationship between the cost of real estate and the height, the topographic height of the map. So as the water rises, it shows you if I don't make a lot of money, there are very few places I'm able to live, right? In this place. So I have this data, but I also get the sensation of like drowning, right? And so I'm kind of interested in this idea of how we like kind of create some more embodied ideas. Another precedent is Laura Devendorf. This is Anatomy of a Cyborg 3D Printer. And this is from the Additivism cookbook. What's happening here is Devendorf is wearing like a laser locator and wielding a glue gun, right? So you can imagine the glue gun is telling her the laser telling her where to point the glue gun, and she's moving around laying down glue. And I think many of you, I'm hoping, are taking the sculpture class in which you get to do some 3D printing. But you might know that a 3D printer is basically just a nozzle that lays down a little bit of plastic, right? So here she's sort of embodying the role of the 3D printer by laying down that glue. In this section 2 for me is where I'm introducing an idea that I call CNC or machine drawing. This is just like a quick video from my machine. We'll see a little bit more in a minute. And any of these things in pink, I'll like cover them briefly, but if you'd like more information later, I'm around, or you can email me. I'm also thinking about parametric design. So this is, I think you can see there's like a little wing form here, and this is a program I wrote and a thing I designed. And this wing form, I haven't designed every single shape you're seeing here, right? I've I've written a program that says, okay, I have a spine, and it can be very short, it can be very long. I have some webs, they can be short or long. I can have 200 webs, or I can have 3 webs. I can manipulate the curves in these ways, right? So I give the thing parameters for how it can move, and it gives me these shapes. Incidentally, this is a program I designed when I was working with Lisa on a conference back in 2008. We really do go way back and have had so many generative conversations. And it's based at its inception on a Leonardo flying machine wing form. So if you think about those flying machines and that sort of like dream of understanding the world in a particular way, I'm kind of quoting that too. So I'm using this sort of parametric process, and again, the machine drawing. This is literally just a vinyl cutter that I've kind of set up to hold a pen. So I can write, I can draw, or I can make something digitally and give it this really like, kind of looks like a print, right? This is printmaking paper and archival ink and all of that. So that, for me, that's a really, like a part of embodiment. And I made a range of variations on this, right? So I think you can see that parametric thing, right? This is one program, and this is like 3 versions, 3 prints coming out of that program. This is Whirl. Thinking about mutants, so like that parametric design and its relationship to ideas about like evolution. What happens when I push those parameters really far in one direction or another? Just a little close up. Thinking that, right? Those are all just like pen lines, ink lines. Here, again, thinking in the direction of embodiment, these are small pieces of mylar plastic. So cut out of plastic. Here they are in another form. So trying to find, you know, again, ways to think about the digital, ways to think about systems, but kind of like not be on screen. And also just figure out like, what can I make? Like, can I take this idea, draw it with a pen, cut it with a knife? And then in the next, this is still a very experimental, but this is a version in which I have like this is a small electromagnet that's kind of making the object flutter, right? So like there's a lot of like play here, right? Like it's just kind of neat to be able to make a thing flutter, and I think that's okay, right? Like to have a little bit of delight within that system. Just here's a final iteration of that because it feels nice. So this is all out of the same basic program, run a few different ways. I like this part here where you can see it gets down to like 2 or 3 webs, right? And for me that kind of like decodes the whole program. That like this tiny little thing, you just add more lines to it and it becomes very complex really quickly. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about curiosity. I'm just checking the time. We've talked a little bit about curiosity, a little bit about embodiment. The second to last sort of idea I want to float is the idea of situated knowing. So I've thought a lot about how we live in this sort of very digital context, and how I sort of like how I sort of reckon with that in a material world. And in this section, I'm thinking a lot about like how I and my communities fit in, right? So we have a real feeling that like when we have data, say, we know or we understand, and we know, and I think what scholars know is that this is highly contextual, right? That you can show us the data, and the context for that data means maybe so much more than the data itself, all alone. And a few precedents for this. This is L.J. Roberts' work. This is called Queer Houses of Brooklyn. And I saw this work in 2019 in New York. Yeah, it was 2019 in New York. And for whatever reason, this show just like absolutely broke my heart. So this is a map, you could say, and what you're seeing are like the queer co-ops across Brooklyn, which are those little pink triangles. They're sort of illustrated with buttons made by Bud Stutzky. The material you're seeing here is made on like Barbie knitting machines. So it's this big, sort of vibrant, kind of loosely put together work, right? That gives us it gives us information about this community, but is like so of the community, right? It's quite ad hoc. It's very much making do with the materials we have. It's really collaborative, right? So L.J. Roberts, they sort of coordinated this effort. But you can see there are a lot of folks working together on it. So I'm thinking about situatedness, how do I fit into a community, right? We could somebody would argue that this is a data visualization, and it's so much more, right? Another point of reference for me here is Tamashi Jackson, who has done a lot of work on Seneca Village in Brooklyn. Seneca Village, yeah. So Seneca Village was a free Black community in New York that was pushed out so that we could build Central Park in New York, right? So we had, what we know is there was a quite vibrant community living in the area that is now Central Park that was evicted to build the park. And in that eviction, we lost so much history, right? So much about the space that can't be recovered. And so one of Tamashi Jackson's projects is to kind of take the fragments we have and kind of help us make sort of bigger, more whole stories out of them. And so I'm thinking about those actual fragments. This is a quilt. This quilt includes fragments from the area that was Seneca Village. It includes memorabilia, and just sort of this idea that we aren't going to get a perfect story, right? We aren't going to get a data visualization of the space, and at this time, just sort of like reckoning with the idea that like just because we can, like, should we try to visualize or make concrete everything that we know in a quasi-scientific way. This is Jeffrey Gibson's work. I think this is a really, really good example of situatedness. This is called Because Once You Enter My House, It Becomes Our House. And Gibson is a Cherokee Choctaw artist who's also a gay man who's really into club culture, right? So this is like a quote from a house music song, but it has like a really interesting sort of communal implication to it. It's done in a style that references like beadwork, and some of these are actually beaded. But I'm kind of thinking about how we're sort of like how it is that we draw on our own experiences and our own situatedness in making the work. And for me, the place I was like really firmly situated at the time was in weightlifting. So here we are. And these are meet results for the USA weightlifting competitions in the US in 2 different years, right? And I want to acknowledge that these are cis women's weightlifting results, right? So I have a particular privilege about being able to compete as a weightlifter. And so all of these dots are like all of the lifts that got made in competition in 1987, which was the first year cis women were allowed to compete as weightlifters. I was 7 years old then, right? So this is like not ancient history either, which I think strikes me quite a lot. So this is 87, and this is 2017. And you can see a few things here. One is you can see there's a lot more people participating, right? There's a lot more lifts. If you look closely, because the dust clouds are sort of proportionate to the size of the lifts, people are lifting a lot more. And the thing I can tell you is the yellow dots on this screen here, those are my lifts. So I've like kind of very directly placed myself in this data set. Yeah?
I was wondering what the dust cloud symbolizes behind the dots.
That's a good question. So in weightlifting, you use a lot of chalk on your hands, right? And so like clouds of dust, when you drop a bar, there's usually clouds of dust, knocking them off. And so it was like literally just like the chalkiness, and I was trying to get at that. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. And so this was sort of a context I was in where we had all of this sort of like information and data. We have lots of, right, there's a lot of politics about women's weightlifting, right? It's kind of a gendered thing. And when I say women here, I mean cis women, because until very recently, it still is quite inaccessible for trans people in general to compete in weightlifting, even though USAW is making accommodations. There are quite a lot of barriers. So I found myself in this data set. There's a lot of data. It's sort of a politically charged space. It's a way to think about bodies, which became really important to me. And so what I'd like to do is take you through the work I did on weightlifting. This is kind of to orient you. This is the key for a work called Every Attempt, and I'm going to zoom in. So here what you can see is these are the results for the 2016 Olympic Games. It was the first time that the US had a gold medal in weightlifting in like 16 years or something. And so there's a cloud of flowers up top, but the way they're organized is there's like a name for each lifter, and then lifters get six lifts during competition, 3 snatches and 3 clean and jerks. And so each flower has 6 petals, 3 snatches and 3 clean and jerks, and the size of those petals is proportionate to the weight of the lift, right? So this is sort of a data visualization. I also have like the weight classes are marked in there, different sort of coding and shapes for like if the lift wasn't attempted or if it was missed. So I can kind of get a lot of information about this event that happened through this data. So this is the key. And the work I made is again built with that sort of parametric design method, right? So thinking about I can make this flower, and this is just an animation that helps me like figure out how to space the flowers. I can make this shape. Let's take that one. I can make this shape, and then I wrote a small computer program, right, that would generate those based on a spreadsheet. And then I cut them out in Mylar. So we had this drawing, we had a spreadsheet, and then we have a drawing, and then I wanted to sort of call out a CNC cutting method. So often when we talk about CNC technology, we think about something like a router, something like a really loud machine, like a plasma cutter. But I want to remind you that like your Cricut, if you've got a Cricut at home, is also a CNC technology. A vinyl cutter is a CNC technology, right? So I'm using a CNC cutter that's a vinyl cutter to take those drawings, cut them out in Mylar. This is for those of you who maybe are drawers. This is Duralar. That is just frosted Duralar. Fold those into form, and then hang them kind of in large measure, right? So I have all this sort of information about a weightlifting meet, but I also have this reference to flowers, which has like been a long historical like thing we use when we talk about women, right? But there's also, I hope maybe you noticed, a real sort of like muscular, like I'm thinking about muscle fibers in these, and to be able to sort of pull all that together and draw it into tension and think about, you know, what it means to lift lots of weight, having been socialized as a woman, kind of moving from that space. Another work in this series is based on motion tracking technology. So this is an image that's tracking like the bar path of a lift. And those lifts, you can see them down at the bottom. These are like the bar paths. And those are then like repeated in an organized way to make a drawing, right? So this drawing is based on one of my training days. So all the lines here are based on what was filmed during my training session. And then they are machine drawn, kind of like the butterflies. This is a training day for my friend Audrey. So I'm thinking about like that motion capture and what that means, but I'm also doing analog motion capture at the same time. So this is my garage at the time, and that's me lifting. And what you see on the wall is like a sheet of tar paper, and connected to my equipment is a chunk of chalk, like a big old chunk of chalk. So that chalk we were talking about earlier is also connected to the equipment here. And so as I'm lifting, I'm drawing lines on the paper, right? And so in this work, and here's a picture of it finished. You can see all like, this is the part that I was standing on down here. So in this, right, I'm thinking about that idea of motion capture, which is like kind of like a wildly popular thing. We see so many images of like dancers making patterns in motion capture now, and it's like really important for like movies and television, right? So I'm thinking about that idea, but I'm also thinking about, we talked about those brushstrokes. I'm also thinking about like abstract expressionists in this moment, right? So folks like Jackson Pollock, y'all perhaps remember that part of that work was about just sort of like the quote unquote pure expression of the artist, like through the body, through the hand, to the paint, right? There was this sort of conception that like there was something like pure and pure is a really dicey word, folks, right? Sort of like pure and unmediated about that move, right? And there were a lot of politics around that at the time, right? There were a lot of powerful white men making these like big strokes on canvas. And so to think about doing a big gestural movement and one that like requires quite a lot of strength to do and kind of mimicking that idea of like a big expressive stroke became part of this work as well. It's kind of, for me, this is just like an artistic poetic way to think those two things together and wonder a little bit about how something like ABEX and motion capture might be related through the lens of sort of like the power of my tiny feminine body doing them. So in the background here, you see the drawings we talked about earlier. And a third component of this project are these sort of felted objects. Again, loosely, are they data visualizations? Sure. This is called 3x10 because there's 3 10-pound plates on the bar, right? But of course, they talk a little bit more about the experience of being a body in space, right? So these are all needle felted. I'm just gonna like highlight felting needles again as a technology. Did you all know needle felt? How many of you have needle felted? Okay, a few of you. Did you all know that needle felting is part of like a really industrial process? Those needles came out of factory machines that were developed in the 1800s but didn't get used for art until the 80s. So this is a very new idea. I'm going to call it out as a technology. But needle felting is the process of using a barbed needle to poke wool over and over again until it sticks together. And then I get this like really interesting sort of push-pull of the hard material, or like this hard subject matter in a soft material. And I'm really into making like super geometric, detailed things because it's a really stupid material to try to do that in. Right? So that like that tension, like sometimes when a thing is stupid or funny, it means something. I've heard, but just like a couple more shots of those. Like I'm quite fond of this one, 2x15. And this is that exhibition. One more. This is just in terms of data visualization. This is like it's kind of cut up differently, but that's a bar and it's loaded to my competition body weight, sewn in canvas and linen.
Is this part of the program related work or any machine related?
This work, so this is, I mean, there's a sewing machine, but this is really just sort of like using the plates as a stand-in for weights. The programming I was doing with the data visualization about the competition and then the organizing the bar path drawings. But yeah, this is just so. So it's using a technology, but not a digital one. So this is the final sort of section of my work before my work's in progress. And here I want to kind of think a little bit about things that are opaque and indeterminate. The work that I'll show you in this section are works that I am making during the pandemic. And so as context, for me, right before the pandemic, I went through a big breakup, effectively a divorce. I moved. I kind of re-established roots in the queer communities around me. I was on my way out of a job. There was just like a lot going on. And I actually read an essay by Teju Cole. I'm sorry I pulled that slide out actually, but if you want the reference, about, later I can get it to you. And he's talking about Roy DeCarava, a photographer, and how his images aren't like crystal clear, and that he's aligning that with the philosopher Glissant's theory that sometimes we need opacity to kind of protect ourselves, and that outside observers don't always have the right to get a crystal clear view of what we're all about, right? And so how do I sort of think about representation? How do I think about the situated knowing in a way that's maybe a little bit less determinate? And at the time I had just acquired, and we'll talk about these too, I just acquired a knitting machine, which made a lot of sense to me as a technology. And I was thinking about how infrastructurally, so there's not like data here, but how it is that we sort of like try to plan infrastructures, how we try to plan systems around us that we can work within, and they like kind of never work out the way we hope they will. Certainly in the pandemic we learned that, right? That our infrastructures were not built to sustain a lot of change, right? And we're built to sustain like certain power dynamics. And so I'm kind of thinking about how maybe the fibers is a stand-in for something a little more flexible, and the plastic, that's that mylar again, is something like a little more manufactured, like work or don't work together. And I made a series of works in which I'm manipulating, this is wool, cotton, and paper. There's some mylar here, but I'll hang out on this one. I'm thinking about how it is that we actually move through the world, making, patching our systems, making little hacks, figuring out a way through a world that wasn't quite built for us. Certainly, yeah.
So, and is this a knitting process also machine engaged?
Yeah.
I mean, computer program knitting by themselves?
So no, this is, and I'll show you the machines in a minute. These machines are manual, but they take patterns. So I can either use like buttons, which is in this case to make a pattern, but they also, some of them take punch cards, which is kind of cool and interesting. But yeah, so these are not like the plastic you see, right? This is all computational, right? I'm writing little programs and drawings to cut and make that like expanded plastic. And I'm trying to make forms that I can set bits of knitting in, but they never quite work, the tension's not right, and then the work becomes about like making them fit, making them work. Which for me felt like the pandemic, right? We had this structure. Even, I don't know, those of you who were teaching at the time, I was too, it was like, we have a plan, and it just like didn't work, right? Like nothing worked. I'm sure if you were in classes at the time, your faculty like had a plan and it just didn't work. And so we just decided to like be humans and make it through, right? And so we can talk about that in terms of the pandemic, but we can also talk about like an experience of marginalization, right? To kind of work in a world in which I can't move through quite as easily as I would like, so I adapt, change. Again, this is knitting wool and plastic, and just kind of thinking about, there's not like a clear mechanical instruction book for how these things come together, but we start to make them work. And this is where I'm gonna break out and mention very quickly machine knitting. Part of this work is working with machines like these, and in this picture there are 4 generations of machines. The middle one is from the 50s, the blue one at the top is from the 60s, there's a punch card machine at the back, and this is my newest. This is an electronic machine that I am currently in the process of modifying to run on contemporary software. So that is a computer. It will be a computer-powered machine soon enough. But machine knitting was a thing that for me was another way to think about systems, to think about patterns, to think about data, but also do it in a really embodied way, and a way that spoke to like part of my own history as like a cis white woman growing up in the world, you know, in a place where everybody around me was crafting. It was a way to kind of think about all of those things together. And this is just sort of for reference, the way a knitting machine pattern looks. So I have, what these are like basically instructions for how to manipulate the machine, right? So it's not it's not instructions for like how to make a thing look like that. It's a thing to like how to operate a machine so it makes a pattern. And I'm interested in that layer of mediation and the way the machine changes, right? This, if you knit, this is very different from conventional knitting instructions or patterns. And I'm interested in how that technology is changing the way we're kind of communicating information too. Just the studio shot of like a more complex knitting project. And then this is the first work where I was kind of thinking about that indeterminacy, but thinking about how we kind of like make a thing work. These are called best laid plans or repair sampler. And so this is a rectangle of Mylar, and I've cut this perfect stretchy rectangle in the middle that's supposed to receive this perfect little bit of knitting. And I actually, when I started these, thought that's what I was gonna do, and I was gonna make really neat, like, you know, like some sort of new, not quite like a Donald Judd, like minimalist thing, but it was gonna be stretchy, it was gonna be like really neat and really evoke this digital, and I had to let go of that really quickly. And I'm glad I did, because I think they're better. So these are a series of them in a line, and you can see even the pulling where I put the knitting in, like torqued the frames. So like it didn't work out, but it worked out, right? Because what they really became about was this sort of like idea of repair and making do. So here you see like a little needle felting, a little darning. These things start to become like scabs or scars or accretions, but they hold together, right? And I think that's the important part, is like they're not failed so much as like successes at holding themselves together. You're right on time, yeah. Okay, are we all doing okay out there? Yeah. All right, so just a little bit on the things I'm thinking about right now. So these are my works in progress. This work, unfortunately it's a little hard to see up there, but this is a knit panel with Mylar parts knitted into it. And in this work, I'm thinking about like a rapid prototyping kind of process. I'm thinking about how I work back and forth between my machines and my materials really quickly. So what you see here, I think you can see there's lots of different shapes of flowers. And what I did is I sort of like tried something, cut it, printed it, tried it again. So this is sort of like the evolution of the process that got me to like the flower at the end. And I'm thinking about, there's an idea called, like we can talk about design in terms of hylomorphic and morphogenic design. Hylomorphic design is where I'm up here, I'm gonna draw a plan, and I'm gonna impose my will on my materials, I'm gonna make it, right? Morphogenic design is the idea that like, I might have an idea, but I'm gonna respond to my environment, and I'm gonna kind of work with my environment and work with my materials in a way that kind of makes sense for myself, my community, my materials, right? So I'm kind of thinking about this idea of morphogenic design as sort of a justice-oriented approach. This kind of responsiveness, and so thinking about this sort of back and forth. Like a quick aside on the project process, for these, I lay a pattern out in Illustrator, and I'm not using 3D modeling software, I'm just kind of unfolding things in my head and making my best guess. But this is like drawn in Illustrator, it's cut out of Mylar on a vinyl cutter, folded up, and then knit in, right, into this machine, right? And so I'm actually physically in this process sitting between a vinyl cutter, a computer, and a knitting machine, and thinking about how I can like rapidly work back and forth between those things and not kind of prioritize one step in that design process. Just another one. And this is still work in progress. Another thing I'm thinking about is like knitting is labor and necessity. So a thing that as I've done research, become really aware of is that most of the histories and scholarship that I can find on knitting is about cis white women. And that is like, despite my looking really hard for work on race, for work on gender more expansively. So I'm thinking quite a lot about what it means to be a knitter and like a white woman, a white cis woman, in this scene, in this like kind of space, and how I can think in a more liberating way about the craft. And one sort of avenue for that for me is thinking about knitting within the history of labor. Yeah, that's 45 minutes. I'm gonna give you 2 or 3 more. And as an example, I've been thinking quite a lot about the Shetland knitters. So this is right around 1900 on the Shetland Islands. Fishing as an industry had kind of crumbled, and subsistence farming wasn't quite enough to have a livelihood. So women in the Shetland Islands were knitting stockings to sell like to make money, right? But we're in such a desperate situation that the Shetland knitters are doing that work while they're doing their other jobs, right? So this is a woman carrying, this is a load of peat, so it's like fuel for the fireplace that they cut out of a bog. She's carrying a load of peat and knitting a pair of stockings that she's gonna sell at the same time, right? And the stories are that you'd be waiting for the train, you'd be waiting for your friends, and just sort of like knitting away. And so kind of trying to connect back to, we often experience knitting today as like a real leisure activity, and that is in part enabled by things like fast fashion, and wealth, and trying to sort of like think back to knitting and like the folks who were kind of using this as labor, as work, as like a necessity. I'm also thinking about how knitting is like a mobile thing, right? This woman is walking with her work. The women who would gut the herring on the coast were also knitters, and would while they were walking from fishery to fishery, knit, and then they'd go gut fish. And I just like that image of like women who have been gutting fish all day, like knitting a sweater, is just like really sensory for me. I'm quite interested. But I'm thinking about the community function and that sort of the way that work can move, which I'm going to call, again, L.J. Roberts, one of my favorite right now, made a work called Carry You With Me, which is a series of embroidered portraits of their friends in New York. But one thing that's interesting about this is they made these riding around on subways, going from place to place. L.J. Roberts doesn't have a studio, but this work can go in a bag in a way that a painting cannot, right? So I'm thinking about these community functions, I'm thinking about the idea of necessity, and I'm gonna just close on a work that I think is kind of funny right now. This is just a pair of underpants, right, that I've knitted on my knitting machine, thinking about what are some of the most like base, not crafty, not beautiful, most necessary objects I might engage with. I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you so much for being here. I'm happy to take questions or talk to you later, but I really appreciate your time and attention. I know this has been like a whole 50 minutes, and that's a long time to sit still these days. So, really appreciate it. That's a really good question. I haven't looked at leaves or spider webs specifically, but I have I've spent a lot of time looking at flowers, right? So some of when I'm designing those new flower pieces is thinking about how flowers in the wild sort of function, right? There's this petal and this pestle, and like thinking about the nature of that organization as a starting point for designing things. I also have a library of photographs of dragonfly nymphs. So before dragonflies are dragonflies, they're in the water and they crawl out and they shed this really cool skeleton, and then they fly off. And I'm thinking about those and maybe making a parametric sort of version of that. Yeah, so I'm interested in I haven't thought about spider webs, but it's it really makes sense for the kind of practice I have. So thank you for that question.
once you started your working or doing a lot of your technological work in 2007, how was it that you came upon the computer and decided that's what you were going to do since it wasn't as popular, or at least it wasn't as accessible?
I got super lucky. So part of it, I started my student career as a biochem major. So I always had like an interest in science and math. And I've always been interested in systems, right? So for my undergraduate work, I made 3,000 copies of the same wax P-pod, and I like numbered them all, and right, like, so I've always been really interested in repetition and always been interested in systems. And I started thinking about things like mass agriculture, right, and like that is a technology that was gonna have an impact on the world. And then because like I moved away from all of my friends at the rise of social media, I got to thinking about that. And then I found a couple of people writing. It was like Hannah Boyd, who was just a blogger at the time, now runs like a major institute in New York, and Lev Nanovich. There were a few people that I could find on the internet who were sort of writing about those processes, and that was really validating to me, right? Because I was like, at that point I was like, computers, I know it's a thing, but I'm not sure, right? I didn't have any words to hang around it. So like I found a couple of people, and then I had a friend in astrophysics who was like, you know, you're making things that are like algorithms, you ought to be able to code that. And so I just got like a little nudge, and it just like made sense for my practice after that. But I got really lucky, right? Right when I was starting to learn to code, I got a full-time job, so I had like the affordance to like sit down and learn a thing. Yeah, some of it's just luck, some of it's just like that's how my brain works. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I was just wondering, I know you talked a little about like making mistakes and kind of like when things don't go your way. I was wondering, I know with more traditional works of art, like you can just erase it. But I was wondering, like, with this kind of thing, how do you work with and work around things not going as planned?
That's a really good question. And it's actually something that is interesting and important to me because I want to live in a world where things don't always go as planned, right? It's part of that, like, we were talking about the hylomorphic and morphogenic design, right? I'm not really interested in a world where I can like design a thing and like the machines do their thing and then it exists, right? Like, because I like to interact with the world. And so for me, part of it is I work with like slightly obsolete technology so that I can like break it, I can put my hands in it, I can own it. So like usually when things don't go as planned, maybe a program I'm trying to write doesn't draw the pictures I want. And then I can kind of decide like, are these valuable in their own right or not? And then sometimes it doesn't go as planned because like the program works, but the machine won't do what I want it to do. And then I get to like solve a whole bunch of new problems, right? So I think for me, like, usually it's like a technical hiccup goes wrong. But if I was just working in Photoshop or just like making things to 3D print, I wouldn't have as many like opportunities for fun hiccups and fun problem solving. So I think it's probably that, just like working with older machines and being sort of receptive to those things. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Let's see, in the back and then here.
When you were doing the chalk tracking of your bar movements in your garage, did your mind switch between making the art or lifting the bar? Did it affect one or the other of your kind of?
That's a good question. So the thing about weightlifting movements is they're like really fast and really specific. And so in the moment that I am lifting, like my safety requires that I'm thinking about lifting and nothing else. And I had it set up so that like the chalk was kind of spring loaded and the paper like was suspended off of the wall so that like if something went bad, I wouldn't get hurt. I certainly set up the scene, right? And in a way that I'm like, okay, I am making art, right? Like I rolled that tar paper down the wall and across my platform, and that was an art decision, right? I didn't need the paper on my platform. So I'm making a lot of decisions in that moment. And I'm making a lift and I'm looking at what's happening. But I'm following like a training program, So yes, like I'm kind of switching back and forth. In the moment of lifting, like I need, like for my own safety, I'm just lifting. But everything else around that is like totally staged. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank
Cool.
you.
Thank you so much. First of all, it was really fascinating, so many aspects. But one question I'd like to ask is just to do with color choices, because I noticed like some of the earlier works, when you're working really with screen, you're kind of like an electric blue kind of, whatever they call it, like, images, and then more recently the color choices seem to be more neutral, softer, lighter, like more monochromatic, I should say. And are those very conscious decisions, like, or just partly like this is the materials I'm working with, mylar is mylar color, and so that's it, or because like now with knitting you can really like you got the rainbow,
Right.
or infinite, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you're making those decisions.
Yeah, they're kind of complicated. So when I was using a lot of color, it was, I was sort of like raised in a sculptural tradition where, color is important, but it is often coming from the materials, and I'm not thinking about color in the same way. And so part of the digital work being so bright was for me like trying to coax more like surface, more tactility, more something out of the, like trying to get more out of the medium. I'm not great with color, like it's not my strength, so I often avoid it. But when I started with the mylar, I was kind of interested in like making something that was sort of like a figment of itself, right? So it's sort of translucent, it kind of doesn't exist, right? I was kind of avoiding color and trying to make these sort of like ghosts of digital ideas was sort of my first thought. And in part it's just like that's the color, and it's pretty tough to like draw on that stuff in an archival and sturdy way with a machine. It's doable, but it's not ideal. And then with the knitting, I started knitting using and continue to use, I was only using like secondhand yarn that I could buy at the thrift store, and because of where I was, it was all that like cream colored crochet yarn. And so for me that became also the symbol of like, I don't know, like a working class crafting aesthetic. It was what I had on hand. It's really sort of like, for me, that's my color scheme, right? It's like cream, white, gray. And I'm right now working on a process by which I can unravel old sweaters and reuse them in my works. And so in my studio right now I have piles and piles of color, so it's probably gonna come back. But I kind of,
Really interesting. Stay tuned, right? That's
yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
You talked a lot about like the tactility of your work, in particular with like the groups and clusters of flowers and text messages, and how you needed like that more like physical element. And then from then on, a lot of your work, like to get that warmth, was more physical. Has it become more like digital is a step in the process? Or have you ever done like work where the digital piece is just printed and that's the finished piece?
So I haven't made a piece where like the digital work is just printed in a piece since like 2012. I've made some projections since then, so they're still digital, like interactive projections. But I'm also just sort of philosophically interested in like computing affects us in so many ways that are not about our computer screens. And so how can I kind of get at that and not be on a screen? That's a good question. Thank you.
I was wondering, since we're talking about sort of like knitting and that type of craft being more of a leisure activity, not practical, mostly practical to it here these days. Since you started working with it as an artistic medium, have you started using it in a practical way, like making your own knitted goods or giving them to other people, or has it stayed just an artistic thing?
So I've actually started around my house now. A lot of our dish rags and washcloths are things I've knit, and I think having the affordance of a machine, right? So now I have a machine where I go like this and I can knit 200 stitches, right? So being able to do this and make like a towel real fast makes it a lot easier to make practical things, right? I wouldn't have been able to do, so I think part of the making things practical is just that affordance. You know, because I have a full-time job and all that other stuff. But I'm actually working on a process by which I can make like home goods out of recycled sweaters for that exact purpose. Yeah. And then
I'm curious about mystery. In some way inspired from your work. Even the earlier work, computer generated, generally hardwired, and even symmetrical by repetition, somehow bring me into a world reality I was surprised into. And even the work with machine reading and resolving, you call it problem, trying to put them together, it bring me a kind of into a wondering state as a mystery. Somehow, I think that's the word I come on to. And just wonder how do you think about mystery or something in between that is not totally in your design?
Thank you for that question. I don't know that I've identified the word mystery, but I certainly think about like that which is sort of like embodied, intangible, intuitive, right? That I know I don't have like full control over, and I think for me that's really important. I think for me it's sort of like a pushing back at like everything is knowable through data sets, or you know, we're gonna arrive, everything is not knowable through data sets. Right, so I think for me it's pushing back on this sort of like, I can engage in these technological processes, I can like work well with machines, right? It's not about a fear or avoidance of those, but I can sort of inflect this sort of humanness, and I can let the materials kind of push back too, right? So I think the materials are often what kind of help to bring that mystery and that like tension for me. Even those prints, right? Like there's so many lines in there. I'm not like controlling everything. They layer up and they become quite like deep and confusing, right? And I think that's part of it. I haven't heard it said so nicely. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Cynthia,
There's someone over here, and then Kira has one too.
So, your art is very like technological, right? And like very like pattern oriented. I was wondering if so like I do studio art, so like drawing, so I put a lot of emotion into my art. I was wondering if you do the same thing, and I think you mentioned like you are married. So maybe like how your like relationship maybe affects your art.
That's a good question. So like, I find my work really emotional, in the sense that like, I am trying to coax something out of these technological processes that helps me feel like something is at stake, right? For me and my communities, right? And I think in doing that, it's like kind of like the working between the technological and the intuitive and the emotional becomes a lot of the work, right? Like, so I do a lot of my planning pen and paper, or like with little tiny paper models, and then even like that process where I'm like cutting a piece and then I'm folding it, right? There's a lot of like little hand labor, and it kind of gives me space to sort of like meditate on an idea or a problem. So that's part of it. I think like being married, and I'm recently married, but I am married to a partner who is super supportive of my work, and also in part a software engineer and a scholar of technology. So what's wild is we have like really interesting relationships and conversations around technology, but they're also like, loosen up already, Molly, right? Like for real, like that's really what happens is like, you know, my wife is really good at like play and delight, and so I think that like, right, like maybe that's why you're gonna see a bunch of color in the next body of work. I don't know, but like there's like, it's a really healthy like because I respect them so much, right? Like they're so smart and they know so much about technology, and then they're like, "You're allowed to have fun, did you know?" So that happens too. I'm like really, really lucky that that's the case. Kira, did you have a question?
That seems like such a good point to leave it on, though. That's so beautiful. But I was wondering if a lot of the work you're making seems to be about the body, but in absence. And I guess that is data visualization. But it also seems really performative. And I was wondering if you consider it performance, and what's the impact of doing a performance where the body is not present. Is that our focus?
I'm really interested in that idea, right?
Yeah.
So, because contrary to this arrangement, I don't love attention. So, I think there's like something about like the energy of the body and the presence of the body that for me is really important to my work. A lot of the feedback I got in graduate school was that I was not present in my work. Because it was like, at that point it was like lots of laser cutters and 3D modeling, and so I think there's sort of like this performative gesture in all of my work, even if it's just sort of like, you know, knitting, which looks like this, like doing a motion, trying to capture some of that gesture, trying to capture that like the human presence. I don't have a good answer for this question. It's a good question, and I don't have a great, but like I think that human presence is important, and I think you're right. Like those like weightlifting drawings are super performative. I think I'm thinking a lot right now about as I buy knitting equipment, I'm noticing how my own like white privilege allows me to move through space, and I think there's probably opportunities for some performative work there too. Yeah. What does that kind of answer it? It's a really helpful question. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we're right to time. So if there's no other questions, let's give Molly another round of applause. And those were some fantastic questions.
Yeah, they
So-
were.